The town of Dreger lay silent under the heavy shroud of night, its cobbled streets gleaming under the pale moonlight. Yet, beneath the surface of this eerie calm, terror had begun to seep into the bones of the townsfolk. Over the last few months, children had been vanishing without a trace, disappearing from their homes in the dead of night. No one heard a sound, no one saw a thing, but the children's empty beds and open windows left a haunting silence that gripped the village. Among the whispers and prayers of the worried parents, rumors spread of an ancient coven living deep in the hills, vampires, some said, who fed not on the blood of the living but on something far more sinister, the vitality and innocence of children. The elders spoke of a time, long ago, when a pact had been made with these creatures, a pact that had been broken by Dreger's ancestors. Now, the vampires were collecting their due. Young Eliza, just 10 years old, was the most recent to be taken. Her parents were frantic, pleading with anyone who would listen, but none dared venture into the hills. Fear had become a shadow that lurked behind every door. That night, beneath a sky thick with clouds, a small group of desperate townsfolk armed with makeshift weapons and lanterns decided to face the nightmare head-on. They journeyed to the Forbidden Woods, where the trees grew gnarled and twisted, as if trying to keep the living away. The deeper they ventured, the more the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something watching. At the heart of the forest, they found it a grand, decaying manor, hidden from the world as though it were swallowed by time. Its windows were dark, its walls covered in ivy, but an unsettling feeling of life or something close to it throbbed within. As the group entered, the air turned colder, the shadows danced with a life of their own, and a faint, melodic hum echoed through the halls. It led them deeper into the manor until they reached an underground chamber, a stone crypt lit by flickering torches. At the center, bound by iron chains, they found the children pale, weak but alive. But before they could free them, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, tall and regal, with eyes that glowed like embers. Her skin was deathly pale, and her smile revealed sharp, gleaming fangs. "You're too late," she whispered, her voice like silk. "They belong to us now." In a flash, more figures appeared, surrounding the townsfolk, silent, spectral forms that seemed to materialize from the walls. The vampires. The group fought valiantly, but it was no use. One by one, they fell, their screams echoing through the crypt as the children watched in horrified silence. The woman approached Eliza, kneeling beside her as she gently caressed the girl's face. "Such purity," she mused. "You'll grow into something magnificent." And then, the woman's gaze shifted to the shadows. "Take them," she said softly. "We will raise them as our own." As the children were led away into the darkness, the manor seemed to close in on itself, the walls shifting and the ground trembling. When the dawn finally broke over Dreger, there was no trace of the manor, no sign of the townsfolk or the children. Only the wind carried the whispers of their fate, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. But the children, they were not lost. They had become something else, something darker. And soon, they would return to Dreger not as the innocents they once were, but as hunters, seeking the blood of those who had once failed to protect them. The town would never know peace again. The end had only just begun. Months passed, and Dreger, now hollow with fear, had grown accustomed to its grief. The villagers rarely ventured outside after dusk, their doors barricaded with crosses and charms handed down through generations. Yet, despite these precautions, a quiet dread hung in the air, as if something was always watching. No one spoke of the missing children anymore, except for the rare whispers about lights seen flickering deep within the forest, or strange, echoing laughter carried by the wind late at night. But there was one thing that gnawed at the edges of everyone's mind. Eliza. She had returned. One cold autumn evening, she appeared at the doorstep of her family's cottage, her hair tangled and her eyes far too bright for someone who had been missing for so long. Her mother, overjoyed yet wary, embraced her, but Eliza was different now. She spoke little, her skin was cold to the touch, and her once vibrant spirit had dulled into something distant and strange. Eliza claimed she had no memory of her time away, offering vague stories of wandering through the woods, lost and alone. Her family believed her, or at least they tried to, but there was something deeply unsettling about her presence. She would often disappear for hours at a time, slipping away into the night only to return with a vacant stare and a thin, chilling smile. It wasn't long before more children started returning. One by one, the missing children of Dreger appeared at the doors of their homes, looking the same as the day they vanished, but with something inhuman lurking behind their eyes. They spoke in monotones, never cried, never laughed. Their pale skin seemed to reject the sunlight, and they moved through the village like shadows, quiet and unnoticed. No one dared confront them. The parents, too relieved to question the miracle of their children's return, ignored the growing unease that filled the town. But something far darker was brewing beneath the surface. One night, as the village lay still under a crescent moon, strange figures were seen gathering at the edge of the forest. Tall and gaunt, with glowing red eyes, these figures were the same vampires the villagers had once faced in the manor. Yet now, they did not hide. They stood openly at the border, watching Dreger with a predatory hunger. Eliza, along with the other returned children, had been leading them. The truth was a sickening revelation. The vampires had not simply returned the children out of mercy. They had remade them, turned them into something between life and death. Dreger's children were no longer human, but something darker, more dangerous. They had become the bridge between the living and the dead, cursed to carry out the vampire's will, and the town was their first target. In the dead of night, the children began their work. Doors creaked open, windows shattered silently, and families were led away into the woods, never to be seen again. Those who remained whispered that the children moved like shadows, their eyes glowing in the darkness as they led Dreger's people to the vampires, offering them as sacrifices to the coven. As the town dwindled, the remaining villagers began to see the horrible truth. Their children were no longer theirs. They belonged to the vampires now, and with every passing night, more children slipped away into the shadows, taking their place at the side of their dark masters. But there was one last hope, an ancient legend hidden in the forgotten corners of Dreger's history. It spoke of a way to sever the bond between the vampires and their stolen children, a ritual buried deep within the heart of the cursed forest. However, no one knew if it was real, or if anyone would be brave enough to venture into the darkness again. The villagers had a choice: confront the nightmare they had hoped would end, or flee, leaving Dreger to its slow, creeping doom. But as they debated, the forest grew restless, the whispers from within growing louder. The vampires were growing stronger, and soon, they would have more than just the children. The true horror was yet to come. The villagers, paralyzed by fear, chose inaction. Desperate to cling to what little they had left, they locked their doors and prayed that the vampire's hunger would pass, that the children they once knew would somehow find their way back from the darkness. But the forest had no mercy left to offer. One stormy night, as thunder rumbled overhead, the whispers in the wind grew louder, almost deafening. The ground shook, and from the edge of the cursed woods, the first of Dreger's newly turned children emerged, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. They marched silently into the village, their pale faces emotionless, their tiny hands clutching rusted iron chains that dragged along the cobblestones. Behind them, the vampires followed, their figures towering over the children, cloaked in shadows, their eyes burning with a fierce hunger. They moved with an unnatural grace, their long fingers stretching out toward the homes, where the villagers cowered behind barred windows and bolted doors. Eliza led them. She stood at the front of the group, her once innocent face now twisted into something cruel. She raised her hand, and without a word, the children spread out, moving house to house. They didn't need to break down the doors. The villagers' fear had already let them in. One by one, the doors swung open, and the children entered, dragging their chains behind them. No screams filled the air that night, no cries for mercy. The vampires moved swiftly and silently, feeding on the terror that had been festering in Dreger for so long. The villagers, paralyzed by the very fear they had tried to escape, were easy prey. By morning, the village was empty. The sun rose over Dreger, casting a pale light on the deserted streets, the homes with open doors, and the eerie silence that now claimed the town. Not a single soul remained. Eliza stood at the edge of the forest, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. The children gathered around her, their faces blank, their transformation complete. They were no longer bound by the innocence they once held now. They were creatures of the night, servants of the vampires, doomed to wander the earth in search of new victims. Behind them, the vampires watched, their hunger momentarily sated, but never truly satisfied. Dregger had fallen, but there were other towns, other villages waiting to be consumed. As the last of the villagers' blood soaked into the earth, the vampires retreated into the forest, their dark purpose fulfilled. The children followed, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Dregger as nothing more than a ghost town, a forgotten place where the unlucky might still wander, unaware of the nightmare that had once consumed it. But deep within the woods, the vampires were already planning their next move. The hunger never ended, and the children, they were just the beginning. There would be no salvation for Dregger, no heroes to set things right. The darkness had won, and it was spreading, and soon it would come for others.